The autumn sun cast long shadows across James Washington's meticulously maintained front lawn in suburban Atlanta. At 62, the retired Marine Corps veteran moved with the same precision and purpose that had defined his 20 years of military service. His neighbors often spotted him in the early morning hours, matching his grandson's energy as they raced down the sidewalk, the child's laughter echoing through the peaceful neighborhood. On this particular Wednesday morning, James stood before his bedroom mirror, adjusting the collar of his navy blue blazer. His collection of military medals and ribbons, displayed in a wooden case on his dresser, caught the morning light. Among them, the Purple Heart and Bronze Star told stories of sacrifice that he rarely shared. His fingers traced the edge of the frame, holding a photograph of his son Marcus's judicial inauguration, a moment of pride that still brought tears to his eyes. 20 years in the Marines had left their mark on James, not just in his ramrod straight posture or his precisely trimmed salt and pepper hair, but in the way he approached every aspect of his life with discipline and compassion. After retiring from active duty, he had found his new mission in life: helping fellow veterans navigate the often confusing maze of post-service life. 3 days a week, James volunteered at the Atlanta VA hospital. Today was no different as he guided Thomas, a young veteran struggling with PTSD, through his benefit application. "See this section here?" James pointed to the form with a steady hand. "This is where most folks get tripped up. But don't you worry, we're going to get this sorted out together." His deep voice, warm and reassuring, had a way of putting even the most stressed veterans at ease. The hospital staff had nicknamed him the Veterans' Guardian Angel. Whether it was driving elderly veterans to their appointments, organizing support group meetings, or simply lending an ear to those who needed to talk, James was there. His phone would ring at all hours, and he always answered with the same patience and dedication. Back home, his walls told the story of a life well lived. Photos of his late wife Marie, who had passed 5 years ago, shared space with pictures of their son Marcus's rise through law school to become one of the youngest federal judges in the country. James took particular pride in the latest edition, a newspaper clipping about Marcus's landmark decision in a civil rights case. That evening, as James prepared for his weekly Veterans Support Group meeting, he received an unexpected call. "Dad." Marcus's voice came through the speaker. "I just got nominated for the Federal Appeals Court." James's face broke into a wide smile as he sat in his favorite leather armchair, the one Marie had insisted they buy years ago. "Son, your mama would be so proud," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. The support group meeting ran later than usual that night. A young Marine, fresh from deployment, had broken down while sharing his struggles with civilian life. James stayed behind, sharing stories from his own transition and offering the kind of understanding that only another veteran could provide. It was nearly 10 p.m. when he finally headed home, his ancient Toyota Camry purring softly through the quiet streets. As he drove, James reflected on how life had changed since Marie's passing. She had always been his compass, his true north. Now he found purpose in serving others, in being there for veterans who reminded him of himself decades ago. His son's success was the cherry on top, proof that their sacrifices, their commitment to education and integrity, had borne fruit. The dashboard clock read 10:15 p.m. when James noticed the police cruiser's lights flashing in his rearview mirror. He carefully signaled and pulled over, following the protocol he had practiced countless times with young veterans during their community awareness workshops. His hands moved to the steering wheel at 10 and 2, just as he had demonstrated so many times before. Through his mirror, he could see the officer approaching, flashlight beam dancing aggressively across his car's interior. James took a deep breath, unaware that this routine traffic stop was about to change not only his life, but would spark a movement that would shake the very foundations of law enforcement across the nation. Officer Derek Randers sat in his patrol car, drumming his fingers against the steering wheel as he watched James Washington's Camry roll to a perfect stop. The veteran cop of 12 years had already run the plates, registered to a black male, 62 years old, no priors. Something about the clean record made Randers clench his jaw. In his mind, it just meant the driver hadn't been caught yet. The night air was thick with humidity as Randers stepped out of his cruiser. His body camera, which would later become crucial evidence, recorded every move. 3 complaints had been filed against him this month alone, but his sergeant had brushed them aside with a casual paperwork error explanation. The confidence this brought made Randers' swagger more pronounced as he approached the Camry. James Washington sat perfectly still, hands visible at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. The dome light was on, just as he taught countless veterans in his community workshops. Through his side mirror, he watched the officer's approaching flashlight beam dance erratically across his car's surface. Years of military training kept his breathing steady, even as something in the officer's aggressive stride set off warning bells in his mind. License and registration, Randers barked, not bothering with the customary greeting. His flashlight beam deliberately held steady on James's face, the glare unnecessarily bright. James spoke softly but clearly, "Yes, officer. My registration is in the glove compartment, and my license is in my wallet. I'm going to move slowly to retrieve them, if that's all right with you." Randers' response was immediate and hostile. "Just get the damn documents," he snapped, his free hand already resting on his holster, a detail that would later haunt the police department's internal investigation. James maintained his composure, movements deliberate and measured as he reached for his glove compartment. The situation deteriorated in seconds. As James opened the glove compartment, an old military photo fell out, him in his Marine dress blues, standing proud beside his son at Marcus's law school graduation. Randers caught a glimpse of the uniform. "Playing dress-up, are we?" he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "I bet that's not even you in that picture." James of military training warred with his rising indignation. "Sir, that is indeed me. I served 20 years in the United States Marine Corps, if you'd like to verify." Randers cut him off, yanking the car door open with unnecessary force. "Step out of the vehicle. Now." Across the street, Lisa Chen, a nursing student heading home from her late shift, had stopped walking. Her phone was already out, recording, an instinct born from too many similar incidents in the news. Her hands trembled, but she kept filming, becoming an unwitting chronicler of what would happen next. James complied with the order, his movements still measured and calm. He stepped out, standing tall despite his age, dignity intact. "Sir, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. My name is James Washington, and I was just returning from." The next few seconds would be replayed thousands of times across national news networks. Randers, claiming later he saw a threatening movement, struck James across the face with his flashlight. The veteran never raised his hands, never made any aggressive motion. The security footage from a nearby convenience store would confirm this, showing James standing perfectly still when the first blow landed. Lisa Chen's video captured the horror in crystal clarity, the sickening sound of the flashlight connecting, James crumpling to the pavement, and Randers continuing to strike him even as he lay unconscious. Her scream of "Stop! Oh God, please stop!" would become a haunting soundtrack to the viral video that would rock the nation. 2 other patrol cars arrived within minutes, their officers rushing to the scene. Officer Sarah Martinez, a rookie, immediately radioed for medical assistance, her voice cracking as she reported, "Officer-involved assault, civilian down." Her dash cam recorded her physically pulling Randers away from James' motionless form. Blood pooled on the pavement beneath James's head as emergency sirens wailed in the distance. His phone, thrown from his pocket during the attack, lit up with a text message from his son. "Dad, great news. The appeals court nomination is official. Call me when you can. Love you." The timestamp on that unread message, 10:27 p.m., would later become a poignant detail in the hundreds of news stories that followed, marking the exact moment when a decorated Marine veteran's life hung in the balance, all because of one officer's unchecked racism and a broken system that had protected him for far too long. The emergency room at Atlanta General Hospital erupted into controlled chaos as paramedics wheeled in James Washington's unconscious form. Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation to the witness Lisa Chen, had seen her share of trauma cases during her 15 years as head of emergency medicine, but something about this one made her stomach turn. The patient's vitals were dropping, and the blood matting his silver hair told a story of violence that had no place in a civilized society. Multiple blunt force trauma to the head and face, the paramedic reported, his voice tight with barely contained anger. Victim is James Washington, 62, Marine veteran. Assailant was, he paused, jaw clenching, a police officer. The last words hung heavy in the trauma bay as nurses and doctors exchanged glances. Outside the hospital, a different scene was unfolding. Lisa Chen's video had already hit social media, spreading like wildfire across platforms. Her hand still shook as she gave her statement to internal affairs investigators who had arrived with unprecedented speed. "You never resisted," she repeated, tears streaming down her face. Mr. Washington was just standing there, being respectful, and that officer, that monster. Back at the precinct, Officer Derek Randers sat in an interview room, his arrogance crumbling as reality set in. His usual allies were nowhere to be found. The police chief had taken one look at the video and suspended him on the spot. His union representative, normally quick to defend officers, sat silently beside him, looking sick. 27 seconds, Detective Marcus Rodriguez said, playing the video again. "That's how long you continued to strike Mr. Washington after he was unconscious." Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran of internal affairs, leaned forward. "Want to explain to me why you felt threatened by a 62-year-old man with his hands visible and a spotless record?" Randers' response would later be quoted in every major newspaper. "Those people are all the same. They just haven't been caught yet." The room fell silent, the casual racism captured perfectly by recording devices. His union representative stood up and walked out, leaving Randers to face the consequences alone. Meanwhile, the hospital corridor outside the trauma unit filled with an unusual mix of people. Veterans in their service caps stood shoulder to shoulder with local civil rights activists. James's fellow VA hospital volunteers huddled together, some in tears, others in silent prayer. The nurse who had taken his vitals recognized him. Just last week, he had helped her grandfather navigate his veterans' benefits. Dr. Chen emerged from the trauma unit, her scrubs spattered with blood. The initial prognosis was grim: severe cerebral hemorrhaging, multiple facial fractures, and potential long-term neurological damage. As she delivered the news to the waiting crowd, a young man in an immaculate suit burst through the hospital doors, flanked by federal marshals. "That's his son," someone whispered. "The federal judge." Marcus Washington's face was a mask of controlled anguish as Dr. Chen repeated the prognosis. His normal judicial composure cracked only once, when he saw his father's military photo, still clutched in the personal effects bag, spattered with blood. Across town, Officer Sarah Martinez sat in her car, typing up her report with trembling fingers. She had been on the force for only 8 months, but she knew what she had to do. Her report detailed every racist comment Randers had made during their shared patrols, every routine stop that targeted minorities, every warning sign that had been ignored by superiors. As she clicked submit, she whispered a quiet prayer for James Washington. Local news vans began arriving at the hospital, their satellite dishes reaching into the night sky like metal trees. The story was exploding. Social media couldn't get enough of the contrast: a decorated Marine veteran versus a cop with a history of racial complaints. The security footage from the convenience store had been leaked, showing the incident from another angle. Every frame contradicted Randers's claim of feeling threatened. In the ICU, machines beat steadily as they monitored James Washington's vital signs. A nurse gently cleaned the blood from his face, revealing bruises that would soon tell their story to jury members and millions of television viewers. On the table beside him, his phone continued to light up with messages, from veterans he had helped, from neighbors, from fellow Marine Corps members who were already mobilizing to demand justice. And in the hospital waiting room, Marcus Washington made 2 calls. The first was to the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. The second was to his judicial colleague, who had nominated him for the Federal Appeals Court. "I have to recuse myself from the nomination process," he said quietly. "This is more important." Justice, he knew, would start at home. The rhythmic beeping of medical equipment filled room 412 of Atlanta General's intensive care unit. James Washington lay motionless, surrounded by a web of tubes and monitors, his face almost unrecognizable beneath the swelling. Dr. Sarah Chen studied his latest brain scans, her experienced eyes noting the areas of concern. Day 3 since the assault, and they were still fighting to reduce the cerebral edema. "We need to keep him in the induced coma for at least another week," she explained to Marcus Washington, who had barely left his father's bedside. The young federal judge had abandoned his usual pristine appearance. His tie was loose, and 3 days of stubble darkened his jaw. He nodded silently, his hand resting gently on his father's arm, careful to avoid the IV lines. Outside the hospital, the story had taken on a life of its own. A makeshift memorial had sprung up near the entrance, flowers, cards, and dozens of military photos left by veterans who had been touched by James's kindness over the years. One photo in particular caught media attention. James in his dress blues, helping a wheelchair-bound veteran navigate the VA hospital halls just 2 days before the assault. The morning news droned quietly from the room's TV, showing footage of last night's protests. Thousands had gathered peacefully outside the police precinct, many holding signs with James's military photo and the words, "He served us," who served him. What started as a local incident had become a national conversation about police brutality and the treatment of veterans of color. Marcus's phone buzzed, another call from the Attorney General's office. The case had landed on the highest desks in the Justice Department, but Marcus had removed himself from any official involvement. His focus remained on the steady rise and fall of his father's chest, each breath aided by the ventilator. "Your father's intracranial pressure is still higher than we'd like," Dr. Chen continued, pointing to areas on the scan, "but there are promising signs. His body is strong, likely from all those years of military fitness." She paused, then added softly, "And his blood pressure responds when you talk to him. He knows you're here." The words brought unexpected tears to Marcus's eyes. He remembered being 5 years old, his father teaching him to ride a bike in their driveway. James had run alongside the bicycle, keeping it steady, his strong hands never letting go until Marcus was ready. Now, those same hands lay motionless on starched hospital sheets. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Lisa Chen, the nursing student who had recorded the assault, stood nervously in the doorway. She had been visiting daily, bringing fresh flowers and her silent support. Today, she carried a thick manila envelope. "The district attorney's office asked me to drop off copies of my witness statement," she explained quietly. "And there's something else. Other people from the neighborhood have come forward with videos of Officer Randers' previous incidents. It's a pattern." Marcus nodded gratefully, but his eyes never left his father's face. Down in the hospital cafeteria, a group of James's fellow VA volunteers gathered for their daily vigil. They shared stories about the man who had touched so many lives. Tommy Martinez, a young veteran with PTSD, spoke through tears about how James had talked him down from suicide last year, staying on the phone with him all night and driving him to the VA hospital at dawn. "The neurological team will be doing another assessment tomorrow," Dr. Chen explained, making notes in James's chart. "We're particularly concerned about potential damage to the speech and motor function areas." The words hung heavy in the air. Even if James survived, the road ahead would be challenging. As evening approached, the hospital corridor filled with an unusual sound, harmonious voices singing the Marines' hymn. A group of veterans, some in wheelchairs, others standing proud despite their own injuries, had gathered to show support. The melody drifted into room 412, where the monitors showed a slight change in James's brain activity. Marcus leaned forward, hope flickering in his tired eyes. Dr. Chen quickly checked the readings but cautioned against too much optimism. "It's a response, yes, but we need to be patient. Your father's brain needs time to heal." As night fell over Atlanta, the Washington case continued to dominate news cycles. Outside the hospital, candlelight vigils replaced daytime protests. Inside room 412, Marcus settled into his usual chair, opened his father's favorite book, a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, and began to read aloud, just as James had done for him countless times during his childhood. The monitors beeped steadily, each sound a reminder that James Washington was fighting his biggest battle yet, not on a foreign battlefield, but the truth about a system that had failed to protect a man who had spent his life protecting others. His father had taught him that true justice doesn't always wear a robe. Sometimes it wears a hospital gown. The Department of Justice conference room hummed with activity as Special Agent Diana Rodriguez spread 17 case files across the mahogany table. Each manila folder represented a previous complaint against Officer Derek Randers, each one mysteriously buried or dismissed. The wall-mounted screens displayed Lisa Chen's viral video of James Washington's assault on an endless loop, a constant reminder of why this room was filled at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. "Look at this pattern," Diana pointed to a timeline she constructed. 3 years ago, Randers assaulted a black college professor during a traffic stop. Charges dropped. Last year, he used excessive force against a Hispanic teenager. Case disappeared. 2 months ago, another veteran, also black, all swept under the rug. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago, but the fire in her eyes burned hot. Across town, in a small apartment filled with police memorabilia, Officer Sarah Martinez sat at her kitchen table, typing her fourth supplementary report. Her hands trembled not from fear, but from anger. On multiple occasions, she wrote, Officer Randers expressed explicitly racist views during patrol briefings. Supervisors present included Sergeant James McPherson and Lieutenant Robert Drake. No actions were taken. The investigation had taken an unexpected turn when an anonymous email arrived at the Justice Department. The sender, using the name Badge of Truth, had attached internal police department emails spanning 5 years. The messages revealed a disturbing network of senior officers with systematically protected Randers and others like him. "We've got them," Special Agent Rodriguez whispered, scrolling through the emails. "Look at this one from Police Chief Williams. Handle the Randers situation like usual. No paper trail." She highlighted the date, just 2 weeks before James Washington's assault. At the precinct, the Internal Affairs Office had become a war zone. Detective Marcus Rodriguez, no relation to Diana, interviewed Officer Thompson, who had worked alongside Randers for 3 years. He kept a tally, Thompson revealed, his voice barely above a whisper. Marks in his notebook for every minority he pulled over. Called it his hunting log. The detective's pen pressed so hard into his notepad that it tore through 3 pages. Meanwhile, tech experts recovered deleted footage from Randers' body camera history. The videos painted a horrifying picture of escalating violence and unchecked racism. One clip showed him bragging to fellow officers about targeting certain neighborhoods. Another captured him planting evidence during a traffic stop, a case that had sent a young black man to prison for 2 years. Lisa Chen's viral video had opened a floodgate. More witnesses came forward daily. A retired police dispatcher shared recordings of Randers requesting backup with coded racist language. A former police academy classmate revealed that Randers had been temporarily suspended during training for violent tendencies, but was reinstated after his uncle, a senior officer, intervened. In the evidence room, forensics expert Dr. Maria Santos analyzed the flashlight Randers had used on James Washington. The blood spatter pattern suggests he continued striking well after Mr. Washington was unconscious, she explained to the prosecution team. The angle and force of the impacts indicate intent. She couldn't finish the sentence, her professional detachment cracking. The investigation expanded beyond Randers. Internal Affairs discovered that 17 officers had been present during racist incidents but remained silent. 6 supervisors had actively helped cover up complaints. 2 police union representatives had pressured victims into dropping charges. The corruption ran deep, like roots of a poisoned tree. Social media exploded with new hashtags. #JusticeForJames and #VeteranLivesMatter. But it was the police department's own records that told the most damning story. A statistical analysis revealed that Randers had pulled over minority drivers at 8 times the rate of his colleagues. His use of force incidents showed a clear racial pattern that nobody had noticed for 12 years. Sarah Martinez's testimony proved crucial. She provided dates, times, and witnesses to Randers' racist comments. Her detailed notes, kept since her first day on the force, documented a culture of silence and complicity. "I joined the force to protect and serve," she testified. "What I witnessed was neither protection nor service." As day broke over Atlanta, Special Agent Rodriguez pinned one final document to her investigation board, a photograph from James Washington's military service, showing him receiving a commendation for saving his entire unit during a combat mission. Next to it, she placed Randers' official police photo, his smirk now seeming more sinister than confident. The evidence was overwhelming, but Diana knew this was more than just one bad officer. This case would expose a systemic failure that had allowed racism to flourish behind a badge. As she prepared her final report, her phone buzzed with a text from the Attorney General's office. "This goes all the way to the top. How soon can you present?" The investigation had become a torpedo, aimed straight at the heart of institutionalized racism in law enforcement. And its detonation would shake the foundations of police departments across the nation. The first thing James Washington noticed was the sound, a steady beeping that seemed to echo from somewhere far away. His military training kicked in automatically, Assess the situation, identify surroundings, remember the last known position. But the memories came in fragments, shattered like a broken mirror. Dr. Sarah Chen was checking his vitals when she noticed the slight flutter of his eyelids. After 2 weeks in a medically induced coma, James Washington was fighting his way back to consciousness. She quickly pressed the call button, knowing Marcus would want to be here for this moment, having only stepped out for his first real coffee in days. Page Judge Washington immediately. She instructed the nurse, while carefully monitoring James's vital signs. The brain scans from yesterday had shown promising activity, but with head trauma this severe, they couldn't be certain about the extent of the damage until he fully awakened. Marcus burst through the door of room 412, still clutching his untouched coffee, his tie askew. The sight of his father's open eyes, those same eyes that had watched proudly as he took his judicial oath, brought him to a stumbling halt. "Dad," he whispered, afraid to believe it was real. James tried to speak, but the ventilator tube prevented any words. His right hand twitched, and Marcus was there instantly, grasping it. Dr. Chen watched the monitors carefully as she explained, "Mr. Washington, you're in Atlanta General Hospital. You've been unconscious for 2 weeks. Please don't try to talk yet. Just squeeze your son's hand if you can understand me." The squeeze was weak but definite. Marcus felt tears rolling down his cheeks as his father's fingers tightened around his own, the same strong hands that had taught him to throw a baseball, that had straightened his tie before his first court appearance. Outside the room, the news spread quickly through the hospital corridors. The veterans who had maintained their vigil broke into spontaneous prayer and celebration. Lisa Chen, who had stopped by for her daily visit, sat down heavily in a waiting room chair, overcome with emotion. Over the next few hours, Dr. Chen and her team conducted initial neurological assessments. James was able to follow simple commands. Blink once for yes, twice for no. His memory of the assault was fragmented, but other long-term memories seemed intact. When shown a photo of his late wife Marie, tears rolled down his cheeks. The media gathered outside the hospital as word spread of James Washington's awakening. The story had grown far beyond a single act of police brutality. It had become a national referendum on racial justice, police accountability, and the treatment of veterans. Protesters who had gathered daily now held signs reading "Welcome back, James," and "Justice is awake." By evening, doctors had removed the ventilator tube, replacing it with a nasal cannula. James's first raspy words were directed at his son. "Marcus, the nomination?" Even through damaged vocal cords and facial fractures, this primary concern was for his son's career. Marcus shook his head, smiling through tears. "Some things are more important than career advancement, Dad. You taught me that." He explained how the case had sparked nationwide police reform initiatives, how 17 other victims of Officer Randers had come forward, how Sarah Martinez's testimony had exposed years of systemic racism in the department. James listened, his military training helping him process the information methodically. When Marcus mentioned declining the appeals court nomination, James managed a weak smile. "Proud of you, son," he whispered. "Standing for what's right." The evening news showed split-screen coverage. James Washington's military photo beside footage of nationwide police reform protests. His case had become a catalyst for change, his sacrifice unwitting but profound. In precincts across the country, officers were being retrained, protocols rewritten, oversight strengthened. As night fell, Marcus read aloud from his father's favorite book again, just as he had every night during the coma. But this time, James's eyes followed the words, and his lips moved silently along with certain passages he remembered. The monitors showed strong, stable vital signs, a warrior's heart still beating with purpose. Dr. Chen made her final notes for the day. Patient shows remarkable resilience. Limited verbal response but strong cognitive recognition. Family support optimal for recovery. She paused, then added, "Patient's first concern upon awakening was for others, consistent with his history of service." Outside room 412, the corridor remained full. Veterans in wheelchairs, civil rights activists, fellow judges, and ordinary citizens continued their vigil, not in sorrow now, but in celebration. James Washington had awakened to find his personal tragedy had sparked a national awakening, his pain becoming a catalyst for the change he had always fought for, one small act of service at a time. 6 months after James Washington's assault, the federal courthouse in Atlanta buzzed with tension. The marble halls, usually quiet and austere, thronged with media, activists, and citizens awaiting the verdict in Officer Derek Randers's federal civil rights trial. In the front row of the packed courtroom, James Washington sat tall, his military posture returned despite lingering physical challenges from his injuries. Marcus sat beside his father, not as a judge but as family. The past months had transformed both men. James's silver hair had grown back, now covering the scars from his surgeries, while Marcus had found a new purpose beyond the bench, working with veteran advocacy groups to prevent similar tragedies. "All rise," the bailiff called out. Judge Patricia Rodriguez, specially appointed from Texas to ensure impartiality, entered the courtroom. The jury filed in behind her, their faces grave with the weight of their decision. James reached for his son's hand, just as he had done during his recovery. The verdict was unanimous. Derek Randers was found guilty on all counts: violation of civil rights under color of law, aggravated assault, filing false police reports, and hate crimes. But the trial had exposed more than one officer's crimes. The investigation had uncovered systemic racism throughout the department, leading to the resignation of the police chief and 6 senior officers. Outside the courthouse, Lisa Chen hugged her fellow witnesses. Her video had been crucial evidence, but more important was her daily support during James's recovery. She had become like family, joining the Washingtons for Sunday dinners where James now shared stories of his military service with a new sense of purpose. Officer Sarah Martinez, promoted to sergeant after her testimony helped expose departmental corruption, stood at attention in her dress uniform. "The thin blue line shouldn't protect hatred," she told reporters. "It should protect justice." Her words would later be inscribed on the walls of the new Police Academy Training Center. James's recovery had become a symbol of resilience. 3 days a week, he still volunteered at the VA hospital, now using his own experience to help other trauma survivors. His speech occasionally slowed when he was tired, and his left hand sometimes trembled, but his spirit remained unbroken. If anything, the assault had strengthened his commitment to service. The Justice Department's final report triggered nationwide police reform. 23 states adopted new accountability measures named the Washington Protocols. Police departments across the country implemented mandatory bias training programs, with James occasionally speaking to cadets about his experience, not with bitterness, but with hope for change. Marcus had found his own path to justice. Though he declined the appeals court nomination, his work on police reform legislation had earned him a different kind of respect. "My father taught me that true justice isn't about power," he told a graduating class of law students. "It's about service." After the verdict, James made his way to the courthouse steps, supported by his son. Cameras flashed as he approached the microphone, but he spoke not to the media, but to the gathered crowd of veterans, activists, and citizens who had supported him through his recovery. "This verdict isn't just for me," he said, his voice strong despite its new roughness. "It's for every person who has faced injustice wearing a uniform, whether that uniform was military or civilian. It's for every parent who has feared for their child's safety during a traffic stop. And it's for every good police officer who wants to serve with honor." The Washington Foundation, established with the settlement money from the civil lawsuit, began funding scholarships for minority veterans entering law enforcement. "Change happens from within," James explained at the Foundation's launch. "We need guardians who understand both service and justice." Lisa Chen, now graduated and working as an ER nurse, created a training program for medical professionals dealing with victims of police brutality. Sarah Martinez helped implement new oversight procedures that became a national model. Even Marcus found a way to serve justice outside the courtroom, teaching civil rights law at his alma mater. 1 year after the assault, James Washington stood before a new class of police cadets. The tremor in his hand was noticeable as he pinned on his Marine Corps badge, but his voice was clear. "Your badge is not a shield from accountability," he told them. "It's a symbol of service, and service requires courage. The courage to stand up against injustice, even when it wears the same uniform as you." In room 412 of Atlanta General, now renamed the Washington Recovery Unit, a plaque tells the story of how one man's injury became a nation's healing. Below James's military photo, it reads, "Justice, like recovery, happens one brave step at a time."